NBC's Courtney Kuby reporting from the Pentagon for us. Courtney, thanks so much. She leads perfectly to our next guest, retired U.S. Army Captain Brian Alexander, who was a helicopter pilot with the same battalion involved in this deadly crash. Captain, thank you for being with us today. Boy, we're lucky to have your expertise, having flown this helicopter with this battalion, very familiar with this airspace. What are your initial reactions, responses to what we heard in the press conference, but even just seeing the video and listening to air traffic control?
Yeah, well, first of all, with everyone else, you know, our prayers go out to all the victims, and it's just a terrible morning. There's really nothing to say in terms of how tragic this accident is. I would echo the idea that it was one that certainly seems to have been preventable based on the preliminary information, both radar and the communications that we've reviewed. It's too early to speculate, but it does appear, based on the fact that this is a routine flight, you've got the helicopter transitioning from the north to the south on the prescribed helicopter route. He's in communication with air traffic control. Their transponder is up so that the controller can see them on the radar. The same is true for the American Eagle jet, so the controller can see both aircraft. What you have is the one aircraft transitioning under visual flight rules, and then the commercial airliner coming in for what they've described as a standard approach. I think what's interesting here is sort of two things can be following the rules at the same time, and you can still have an accident like this, unfortunately, because of the human factors involved. Here, I believe the fact that the CRJ was cleared away from landing south to north on runway 1, which is absolutely standard and almost happens all the time, to a circling approach to 33, which is to the northwest, brings the regional jet out over the river more than is typical, creates a different expectation for what the helicopter pilots might have been anticipating. In addition, you've got multiple aircraft stacked up to runway 1, proceeding south to north as the helicopter comes north to south. It's entirely possible that the aircraft he was informed of, that he identified, was in fact one of the other aircraft proceeding south to north for runway 1, and he didn't see, with all the lights in that area, the actual aircraft that was circling to land on runway 33. So that's speculative, of course, but certainly a possibility that the NTSB will be looking at when they process all the data.
Yeah, and we've been hearing that from other experts this morning. That's a really good point, which is that when air traffic control says to the helicopter, do you see the aircraft? They say yes, in the affirmative. This has happened in other accidents, smaller aircraft, but still air disasters. Yes, I do see it, but talking about a different aircraft. Can you take us inside the cockpit of this helicopter, like the one that was flown last night that collided? What would have been going on a training mission with 3 soldiers aboard? What's the visibility? Clear night, by and large. As you said, a standard approach for this plane. The helicopter obviously very aware of the commercial aircraft coming in and out of DCA. Can you kind of walk us through what that night would have been like on a training mission and what they could have seen?
Sure, Willie. First of all, I think Courtney was right. This is a heavily congested area, but it's sort of like any of us that commute into New York City or Washington, D.C. every day and get on the 95. You know, it's still congested but routine, and the routes are prescribed. It's a known that the traffic is there. So even though there's a lot going on, it is sort of quote unquote typical. In this actual helicopter, we don't know what the routine training flight was doing, but it is in fact routine to have helicopter crews go through that area to learn the route structure, to become familiar with communications with air traffic control. There are a number of contingency missions that this unit performs, as you can well imagine, in the District of Columbia. Classified contingency missions, evacuation of federal buildings, evacuation of the White House, classified things of that nature. It could have been that, but I suspect it was a more routine familiarization or refresher training flight, which happens all the time for crews to maintain their proficiency in how to navigate this particular area as they operate in and out of the Pentagon, for example. And as I said, I think what we'll find is the investigation will focus on the communications between air traffic and the two aircraft, as well as the visual and perceptive cues available to the crew in the helicopter, particularly on this particular flight.
So as we talk about, you mentioned the communications with air traffic control. We heard from Transportation Secretary Duffy that he doesn't believe the two aircraft spoke to each other, but as is standard, I think they communicate through air traffic control. Would there be any kind of communication between the regional jet and the helicopter itself, or does everything go through the air traffic tower?
Yeah, so if assuming that they're all on the same frequency, everyone can hear everything that's going on. So the regional jet pilots would be able to hear the communications between air traffic and the helicopter, and the same for the PAT 25 crew, but they do not communicate directly to one another. It's air traffic control that has the obligation to keep traffic clear of one another. It's the primary duty for air traffic control, and to issue alerts and warnings as appropriate to make sure that that traffic separation is confirmed and accomplished, for obviously for these very reasons. So again, I think what we'll find out is there are obviously either some quote unquote miscommunications or an identification of perhaps the wrong aircraft, which may have been part of the sequence of events to bring this about.
We've been careful not to speculate this morning, and we will continue with that. But just because you have such experience and you have watched that video and you've listened to air traffic control, you've heard everything that we heard in that news briefing a short time ago, what is your gut telling you? What is your instinct telling you about what may have happened?
Well, as I was just describing, again, most regrettably, I think the human factors element will be the main focus. Having flown in that area so much, I will tell you that the lights and the amount of traffic, I can see how a pilot could make this type of mistake in a moment. But again, way too early to speculate. But that certainly is what the evidence is suggesting as a possibility. There could have been other distractions within the cockpit that we know nothing about at all. It does seem as though the regional jet was following air traffic control's commands and sort of doing what one would absolutely anticipate in order to execute what started as an approach to runway 1 and then became a circling approach to runway 33, would have a lesser opportunity to perhaps see PAT 25. The call out from air traffic control was to the helicopter to identify and see and avoid the commercial jet. So that too bears some relevance here, but it's just a terrible tragedy, and I could not agree more. One that was completely avoidable.
Yeah, a terrible human tragedy involving 67 lives. As we can see, those first responders still working right now to recover more bodies. The last word we got out of that news briefing was that 28 in total had been recovered. Retired U.S. Army Captain Brian Alexander, we're so lucky to have your experience and your expertise with us this morning. We appreciate you taking the time with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. God bless the families.
Absolutely.